My ex-husband, Richard, roared with laughter when I told him I used my divorce settlement to buy a dilapidated bookstore. He couldn't grasp why I'd waste a fortune on dusty shelves and peeling paint. But now, he's just read that my little town is Hollywood's new darling, and my worthless shop is the one property they can't buy, making it priceless. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The finality of our separation wasn't marked by a signature on a legal document or the division of 2 decades of shared belongings. It was marked by the sound of Richard's laughter. It was a specific kind of laughter, one I knew well, a booming, dismissive sound that filled a room and left no space for anyone else's feelings. It was the sound he used when one of his junior associates made a foolish suggestion, or when a rival developer's project failed spectacularly. It was a laugh that judged, condemned, and finalized, and he was directing it at me. We were on the phone. My boxes were stacked high in a sterile, temporary apartment that smelled of fresh paint and loneliness. His were likely already unpacked in the sleek, minimalist penthouse he now called home, the one with panoramic city views he'd always wanted. I had just told him what I'd done with the settlement, the money that was supposed to be my fresh start. "You did what?" he'd asked, the words stretched out with incredulity. My voice was small, but I tried to fill it with a conviction I didn't entirely feel yet. "I bought a bookstore, Richard, in a little town called Havenwood. It's called the Gilded Page." The silence on his end was heavy, pregnant with the judgment I knew was coming. I pictured him perfectly, standing by his floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of something expensive in hand, shaking his head with a patronizing smirk. Then it came. The laugh. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was a full-throated, incredulous roar that echoed down the phone line and seemed to rattle the very bones of my new, fragile life. "A bookstore? Iris, for heaven's sake," he finally managed, catching his breath. "A dusty, failing, dilapidated bookstore? What were you thinking? That's not an investment, that's a charity case. You took a substantial amount of money meant to secure your future, and you threw it away on a romantic fantasy." "It's not a fantasy to me," I whispered, my hand tightening on the phone. "It's something I need to do for myself." "For yourself?" He scoffed, the humor gone now, replaced by a familiar, icy condescension. "What you need is a financial advisor, not a pile of rotting timber and termite-infested paper. I thought you had more sense. I guess I was wrong. Good luck with your hobby." He didn't say goodbye before hanging up. He never did. The click of the disconnected call felt like a gavel striking down, the final verdict on my foolishness. I sank onto a cardboard box, the city lights twinkling far below my window, feeling smaller and more foolish than I ever had in my life. The settlement, which had felt like a form of liberation, suddenly felt like the capital for my greatest failure. Richard had always been the one who understood value, who saw the world in terms of profit margins and assets. I had only ever seen it in terms of stories. In that moment, sitting alone in an empty room, I was terrified that he was right. The purchase of the bookstore wasn't an act of empowerment. It was proof that I was incapable of surviving without him. The pain of his mockery was worse than the loneliness of the divorce itself. The first few weeks in Havenwood were a blur of dust and doubt. The bookstore, the Gilded Page, was less dilapidated than Richard's imagination had painted it, but it was far from pristine. It was a 2-story brick building on Main Street, nestled between an antique shop and a bakery. It had good bones, as the inspector had said, but its soul was tired. The previous owner had passed away, and his children, eager to unload the property, had let it sit empty for a year. A fine layer of dust coated every surface. The air smelled of decaying paper and forgotten things, and the once vibrant burgundy paint on the facade was peeling like a sunburn. Every creak of the floorboards, every bill that arrived for electricians and plumbers, echoed Richard's laughter in my ears. I'd wake up in the small apartment above the shop in a cold sweat, his voice a phantom in the room, a romantic fantasy, a pile of rotting timber. I threw myself into the work with a desperate, frantic energy. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, sorted through water-stained boxes of unsalvageable books, and designed new layouts for the shelves. The physical labor was a balm, a way to sweat out the anxiety. The town was quiet, a stark contrast to the relentless hum of the city I'd left behind. People ambled, they stopped to talk. The owner of the bakery, a plump, rosy-cheeked woman named Mrs. Gable, brought me a welcome basket filled with scones and jam. My most frequent visitor was Martha Gable, a woman in her late 60s with a shock of silver hair and eyes that sparkled with a lifetime of curiosity. She owned Havenwood Antiques and Curios, the shop next door. She appeared on my third day, holding a dusty Tiffany-style lamp. "Thought this might look nice in your reading nook," she'd said, her voice raspy and warm. The old place needed a woman's touch. My brother Henry, God rest his soul, loved his books but didn't have an eye for atmosphere. It turned out the previous owner was her brother. Martha became my anchor. She'd bring me tea in the afternoons and listen as I spoke of my progress, never once mentioning my divorce or asking why a woman from the city had suddenly decided to bury herself in their sleepy town. She seemed to understand, without needing an explanation, that I was building more than a business. About a month in, Richard called. It was unexpected. We hadn't spoken since that final, brutal conversation. His name flashing on my phone sent a jolt of pure dread through me. I answered, my voice wary. "Iris," he said, his tone clipped and impersonal. "I'm just calling to let you know my lawyers will be sending over the final asset transfer documents. There's a joint account we overlooked. It's nothing significant, but it needs your signature." "Okay," I said, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "So, how's the project?" he asked, the word dripping with disdain. "Have you come to your senses and put the for sale sign back up yet?" I looked around the shop. The shelves were now sanded and restocked with a mix of old treasures and new inventory I'd painstakingly curated. Sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The Tiffany lamp from Martha cast a warm, inviting glow over a pair of wingback chairs I'd found in the back room. It was beginning to feel like mine. "It's going well, thank you," I said, a sliver of defiance in my voice. "I'm planning the grand opening for next month." I heard him sigh, a sound of profound disappointment. "Iris, it's not too late to cut your losses. You could still get most of your capital back if you sell now, before you sink any more good money after bad. I know a commercial real estate agent who specializes in unloading distressed properties. I could make a call." His offer to help was the most insulting thing he could have said. It wasn't kindness, it was control. It was his way of reminding me that he was the expert and I was the fool. "No, thank you, Richard," I said, my voice firmer now. "I don't need your help. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "If you say so," he said, the chill in his tone making it clear he believed the opposite. "Just don't come crying to me when you're broke in 6 months. Sign the papers when they arrive." He hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, my heart pounding with a familiar mix of anger and insecurity. He still saw me as the woman he'd married, the quiet librarian who managed his social calendar and organized his life while he built his empire. He had no concept of the person I was trying to become. But as I looked at the rows of books, at the spines promising infinite worlds and endless knowledge, a new thought took root, pushing aside the weeds of his doubt. He had forgotten what 25 years as a university librarian had taught me. He had forgotten my real profession. He thought I just checked out books, but I had managed acquisitions, curated special collections, and understood the deep, intrinsic value of history and information. Richard saw a worthless building, but I saw a story. And he had forgotten one crucial thing. The quietest corners, the most overlooked pages, often hold the most valuable secrets. Our marriage had been a masterclass in diminishment. It hadn't started that way, of course. When I first met Richard Sterling, he was a whirlwind of charm and ambition. I was a young librarian, content in my world of cataloging and research, and he was a junior developer with blueprints in his eyes and a hunger to build a legacy. He found my quiet passion for books charming and intellectual. He'd show up at the library late in the evening, claiming he needed to see me, and I was swept away by the sheer force of his confidence. We married, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his view of my world began to shift. My intellectual pursuits became hobbies. My career, once a source of pride, became a quaint little job that was secondary to his meteoric rise in the cutthroat world of real estate. "It's good for you to have something to keep you busy, honey," he'd say, patting my hand before launching into a monologue about a multi-million-dollar deal he was closing. I became the consummate corporate wife. I hosted dinner parties for investors where I was expected to be elegant, engaging, but ultimately silent on any topic of substance. I planned charity galas that burnished his public image. I packed and unpacked our lives as we moved to bigger and more opulent houses, each one a testament to his success, each one feeling less like a home to me. My own dreams, my quiet desire to one day have a small, curated library or bookstore of my own, were filed away like an old manuscript, deemed too impractical to ever see the light of day. "Iris, be realistic," he'd say whenever I dared to mention it. "There's no money in books. The future is digital. It's steel and glass, not paper and glue." Richard was a man who worshipped at the altar of the tangible. His world was one of polished surfaces, impressive facades, and measurable growth. He wore exquisitely tailored suits, drove a German sports car, and his handshake was firm, his gaze direct. He was handsome in a severe, corporate way, but beneath the polished veneer there was a hollowness. He didn't build communities, he built properties. He didn't see people, he saw assets or liabilities. He was dismissive of anything he couldn't quantify, and that included my inner life. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a quiet erasure. He was being honored at a massive industry awards dinner. I sat at the head table, wearing a dress he'd picked out, smiling on cue. When he went up to accept his Developer of the Year award, he gave a long, eloquent speech. He thanked his partners, his mentors, his team. He thanked the city for its opportunities. He never once mentioned my name. It wasn't malicious, it was worse. It was a complete oversight. In the grand blueprint of his success, I was simply part of the foundation. Essential, perhaps, but buried, invisible, and taken for granted. Driving home that night, the silence in the car was deafening. I looked at his handsome profile, illuminated by the passing streetlights, and I realized I wasn't married to a man. I was living with a monument to a man, cold and hard and impervious to the world I cherished. The divorce was my idea, a quiet rebellion that shocked him. Not because he loved me, I suspect, but because he was furious that a non-revenue-generating asset was choosing to liquidate itself. His condescension during the proceedings was monumental. He treated me like a child who needed her allowance explained to her. His lawyers were sharks, but mine was steady, and I walked away with a settlement that was fair, if not generous. It was the price of my freedom. And now, standing in my bookstore, surrounded by the tangible reality of the dream he'd so casually mocked, I understood him better than ever. Richard wasn't just an antagonist in my story. He was a symbol of a world that consistently misunderstands value. He saw the gilded page and saw peeling paint, low foot traffic, and a poor return on investment. He couldn't see the history in the hand-carved mahogany counter or the sense of community that was already beginning to bloom within its walls. He couldn't understand that for me, the store's worth wasn't on a balance sheet. It was the profit I earned in self-respect every time I turned the key in the lock. This place wasn't just my business, it was my declaration of independence. And Richard, with his glossy brochures and empty penthouses, would never, ever be able to comprehend its true value. The grand opening of the Gilded Page was a modest affair, but to me, it felt like a coronation. Martha had marshaled half the town to show up. Mrs. Gable from the bakery provided trays of cookies, the local florist dropped off a bouquet of sunflowers, and the mayor himself, a kindly man named Arthur Thompson, gave a short, welcoming speech. I stood behind the counter, my heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it almost brought me to tears. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The bookstore settled into a comfortable rhythm. I hosted a children's story hour on Saturdays and started a book club that met on Wednesday evenings. It wasn't wildly profitable, but it paid its own bills, and more importantly, it was becoming the town's living room. It was enough. It was everything. The turning point arrived on a crisp autumn Tuesday, 6 months after I opened. A fleet of black SUVs, sleek and alien against Havenwood's rustic charm, purred to a stop along Main Street. Doors opened, and a group of people in stylish, practical clothing disembarked, speaking into headsets and pointing at buildings with an air of clinical assessment. An electric buzz of curiosity rippled through the town. By lunchtime, the rumor was confirmed. Martha scurried in, her eyes wide. "You are not going to believe this, Iris. It's a television production, a massive one. They want to use Havenwood as the primary location for some big fantasy show, like that one with the dragons." The show, as we would I'll soon learn, was called Ethilgard's Legacy, a streaming service's flagship production with a budget that rivaled the GDP of a small country. They had scouted locations all over the world and had fallen in love with Havenwood's untouched, historic aesthetic. Main Street, they said, was perfect. A town hall meeting was called. A slick, charming producer named Julian Croft laid out the proposal. They wanted to rent out the storefronts on Main Street for the duration of the 6-month shoot. They would redress the exteriors to look like a fantasy village, but the businesses could continue to operate. They were offering rental fees that were, for most of the shop owners, equivalent to a year's profit. The town was ecstatic. It meant jobs, tourism, a vital injection of cash into our quiet economy. The next day, a location scout, a young woman with an iPad and an efficient smile, came into the Gilded Page. She complimented the store's authentic character and incredible bones. Then she got to the point. "Your store, Ms. Thorne, is the absolute centerpiece. It's what our production designer is calling the heart of the village. We have a very generous offer for the inconvenience." She slid a contract across the counter. The number printed on it made me gasp. It was more money than I'd seen in my life, an amount that would have made even Richard sit up and take notice. For that fee, they would have exclusive use of the building's exterior and intermittent access to the interior for key scenes. I looked around my sanctuary. I pictured it filled with cables, burly crew members, and actors in costume. I pictured my quiet corners becoming a noisy, chaotic film set. I thought of the book club, of the children who sat cross-legged on the rug for story hour, of the peaceful solitude I had fought so hard to create. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear and doubt that had been my constant companions since the divorce finally fell silent, replaced by a cool, quiet resolve. This was my place. It wasn't for rent. "Thank you," I said, sliding the contract back to her. "It's a very generous offer, but the bookstore is not available." The scout's smile faltered. I don't think you understand. This is a very significant." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted gently. "The answer is no." I knew I needed to formalize my position. My librarian instincts kicked in. This wasn't just an emotional decision, it needed a strategic foundation. I didn't call the high-powered city firm that had handled my divorce. Instead, I asked Martha for a recommendation. She sent me to see Edgar Finch, a semi-retired lawyer who operated out of an office above the town's hardware store. Edgar was a wisp of a man with spectacles perched on his nose, but his mind was a steel trap. I explained the situation, my refusal to rent, and my fear that the production company would try to pressure me. He listened patiently, then leaned back in his creaky chair. "They will," he said simply, "but they can't force you. It's your property. However, your position is more powerful than you realize, Ms. Thorne." He then explained that my building, being one of the original 5 structures in Havenwood, had a unique historical designation. Any major compulsory alteration for public use would require a level of civic and historical review that would tie them up in red tape for years. My simple refusal was, in effect, a veto on their entire plan for Main Street. My leverage wasn't just my ownership, It was the history embedded in the bricks and mortar. The very thing Richard had called a pile of rotting timber was protected by a legacy he could never appreciate. I had moved from being a passive victim of my past to the active protector of my future. I wasn't just investigating, I was fortifying. The Gilded Page wasn't a trap I had set, but its inherent, quiet strength had become one, and the most powerful production company in the world was about to walk right into it. The production company did not take no for an answer. The efficient location scout was replaced by her boss, a man with a tense jaw and a portfolio full of glossy architectural renderings. He tried to dazzle me with art, showing me how the Gilded Page would be transformed into the scribe's lantern, a pivotal location in the world of Ethelgard. When I held firm, his charm evaporated, replaced by poorly veiled frustration. "Ms. Thorne," he said, his voice tight, "perhaps you're not grasping the scale of this project. The economic benefit to this town will be immense. You're holding up progress for everyone." It was the first time they tried to position me as the villain, the selfish old woman standing in the way of prosperity. But I had my conversation with Edgar Finch to lean on. "My bookstore is also a benefit to this town," I replied calmly, my hands resting on my mahogany counter. "It's a place for community, and that's a different kind of progress." Thermora, I added, my librarian's training coming to the fore. "I assume you're aware of this building's designation under the County Historical Preservation Act of 1978. The man's eyes widened slightly. He had clearly not been aware. I had spent the previous evening in the town's archives, a place I felt more at home than anywhere else, and had photocopied the relevant documents. "This building cannot be significantly altered without a review by the Historical Society," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "A review that, as I'm sure your lawyers will tell you, is a lengthy and uncertain process. My refusal to cooperate is not just a personal whim. I am, in effect, a steward of this property's history." I had revealed my first card, and it was a trump. I wasn't just a sentimental shop owner, I was an informed property owner with legal standing. The man's demeanor changed instantly. The condescension was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. He packed up his portfolio, promised to consult with the team, and left the store. The bell above the door chimed his departure, a small, victorious sound. The news of the holdout spread like wildfire. At first, some of the other shop owners were wary, worried I was jeopardizing the deal for everyone. But Martha, my staunch ally, made the rounds. She explained my position, not as a refusal, but as a negotiation for the soul of the town. "Iris isn't saying no," she'd tell people over coffee at the bakery. "She's just making sure these Hollywood types don't bulldoze our history for a TV show." The second, more significant confrontation came a week later, and it came, as I knew it eventually would, through the telephone. I was in the back office, reconciling the month's receipts, when my cell phone rang. The name on the screen sent a familiar spike of anxiety through my chest: Richard Sterling. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "Hello, Richard." "Iris, I've been trying to reach you." His voice was completely different. The icy condescension was gone, replaced by a slick, urgent enthusiasm. It was his deal-making voice, the one he used when he smelled money. "I just read an article in the Financial Times. It's unbelievable. Ethelgard's legacy is setting up shop in your little backwater town. And you're the holdout? You're sitting on a gold mine." He laughed, but this time it wasn't a laugh of mockery. It was the excited, greedy laugh of a prospector who just struck a vein. "You stumbled into the real estate play of the century, completely by accident. It's brilliant." By accident. The word stung, a casual dismissal of my choice, my work, my life. "It's not an accident, Richard. It's my home," I said quietly. Right, your home," he said, brushing it aside. "Listen, you can't handle this on your own. These studio people are sharks, you're an amateur, you'll get fleeced. I'm prepared to step in pro bono as a consultant. We can structure a deal, a lease with an equity upside, performance bonuses tied to the show's ratings. We could make them pay a fortune." "This is what I do, Iris. Let me handle it." The offer was so quintessentially Richard. He saw a massive financial opportunity, and his immediate instinct was to take control, to put his name on it. He didn't see me, the person who had built this life. He saw a bumbling woman who had gotten lucky and needed a man, specifically, him, to swoop in and maximize the profit. "No, thank you, Richard," I said. The calm in my own voice surprised me. "Don't be sentimental," he snapped, the charming facade cracking. "This isn't about your dusty books anymore. This is about securing your future, our future. Well, your future," he corrected himself hastily. "Don't be a fool. What are they offering?" "What they're offering is irrelevant," I stated. "And my future is already secure. I secured it the day I signed the deed to this store." "You're being naive." His voice was rising now, filled with the frustration of a man whose expertise was being questioned by someone he considered his subordinate. "They will find a way around you. They'll get the town to turn on you. You'll be left with nothing but your precious principles and a worthless building." His poorly executed threat, meant to scare me, had the opposite effect. It illuminated the vast, unbridgeable chasm between our worlds. He thought my principles were a liability. I knew they were my only true asset. "The building is not worthless, Richard. You've never understood its value," I said, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I felt taller than him. "And I don't need your help. Goodbye." I ended the call before he could respond. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the quiet, unshakable strength of my own resolve. The spell was broken. His opinion no longer had the power to wound me. He was just a voice on the phone from a world I no longer belonged to, a world that was, I now realized, much smaller than mine. Richard did not take my refusal well. His desperation, cloaked in a thin veneer of concern, escalated. He began leaving voicemails, his tone shifting from wheedling to demanding. He sent emails with links to articles about tough negotiation tactics, titled FWD, "Read this, don't be a fool." He even had his assistant send me a thick portfolio on commercial lease agreements, a gesture so patronizing it was almost comical. He couldn't comprehend a world where his brand of success wasn't the ultimate goal. Meanwhile, in Havenwood, the pressure from the production company was becoming more sophisticated. The producer, Julian Croft, requested a personal meeting. He arrived at the bookstore alone, without his entourage, dressed in a casual sweater, aiming for a disarming, friendly approach. He bought a copy of a classic novel and spoke lovingly of its first edition. It was a well-rehearsed performance. "Iris," he began, leaning against a bookshelf, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I want to understand what you want. Name your price. We're prepared to be extremely flexible." This was the moment I had been preparing for. My case wasn't about extracting more money for myself. It was about reframing the entire negotiation. I had spent my evenings not just reading novels, but reading Havenwood's history. With Edgar Finch's guidance, I had researched municipal codes, historical precedents, and case studies of other small towns that had faced a similar Hollywood invasion. Some had been revitalized, others had been hollowed out, their authenticity lost forever. "It's not about a price, Julian," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "It's about value. You want to rent my building, but you also want to rent this town's soul. I'm not willing to sell that." He looked taken aback. "That's a bit dramatic." "Is it?" I countered. I walked over to a framed map of Havenwood from 1890 that I'd hung on the wall, a piece I'd bought from Martha. "This street, this town, has survived for over a century because it has a strong core. If you come in, film your show, and leave, what happens to that core? Will the bakery be able to afford its rent when the landlords realize they can charge Hollywood rates? Will the next generation be able to open a small business here? Or will Main Street become a row of empty storefronts waiting for the next film crew?" I laid out my terms, which had nothing to do with a personal check. I wanted a community preservation fund, a percentage of the production's local budget set aside for grants to maintain and restore Havenwood's historic buildings after they left. I wanted a guarantee of local hiring for all non-specialized crew positions. And I wanted the production to fund an internship program, partnering with the county high school to give students experience in the trades, carpentry, electrical work, set design. Julian was silent, his charming producer mask gone, replaced by the focused look of a man who realized he was no longer dealing with a simple shopkeeper. "That's unconventional," he finally said. "Havenwood is an unconventional place," I replied. "Take it or leave it." My stance caused a definitive split. Richard, who had apparently hired a local busybody to keep him informed, got wind of my proposal. His next call was apoplectic. "Are you insane?" he shrieked down the phone. "A community fund? Internships? You have the leverage to demand millions for yourself, and you're giving it away to the town baker. I knew you were sentimental, but I never thought you were a complete socialist. This is my money, Iris. The seed money for that store came from our divorce. You are throwing away my money." There it was, the final, ugly truth of his perspective. He still saw my settlement, my life, my choices as extensions of his own wealth. The fact that I was using it to build something based on community and shared value was, to him, a personal betrayal. "It stopped being your money the day the judge signed the papers, Richard," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "And what I'm building here is worth more than any amount you can possibly comprehend. Do not call me again." The final piece of my case clicked into place with that call. My fight was no longer just about protecting a building or a town. It was about proving, once and for all, that Richard's definition of value was bankrupt. The next time I saw him, it wouldn't be a confrontation over the phone. I knew, with absolute certainty, that he would come here. He couldn't stand to lose, and in his mind, this was a battle he was losing. He would need to face me in person, to try and exert the force of his physical presence, the last tool in his depleted arsenal. And I would be ready. The stage was set, not for a TV show, but for the final act of my own liberation. He arrived on a Saturday. It was a brilliant, sunny morning, and Main Street was bustling. I was in the middle of Story Who. Sitting on a low stool with a copy of a beautifully illustrated children's book, a circle of enraptured children at my feet. Through the large bay window of the gilded page, I saw it, a silver convertible, impossibly sleek and out of place, pulling into a parking spot directly in front of the store. Richard unfolded himself from the driver's seat, wearing sunglasses and a blazer, looking every bit the city predator in our pastoral town. My heart didn't sink, it hardened. I calmly finished the story, told the children I'd be right back, and walked to the front of the store, my steps measured and sure. He strode in without acknowledging the gentle chime of the bell, his eyes scanning the interior with a look of undisguised contempt. "So this is it," he said, his voice low and tight. "The famous gilded page. It's even more pathetic than I imagined." "If you've come to insult my business, Richard, you've wasted a trip," I said, my voice even. "I'm busy." "We need to talk," he said, pulling off his sunglasses. "In private." "I have no secrets from my customers," I replied, gesturing to the handful of browsers and the parents waiting for their children. Martha, who had seen his car arrive, had materialized by the shared doorway to her antique shop, her arms crossed, a silent, watchful sentinel. Just then, another car pulled up behind Richard's. It was one of the black SUVs. Julian Croft got out. He had called earlier, asking if he could stop by with the studio's final response to my proposal. It seemed the climax of my personal drama was destined to coincide with my business one. Julian entered the store, saw Richard, and paused, sensing the tension. "Iris, is this a bad time?" Richard turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the producer. He saw a rival, another shark in the water. He immediately shifted into his aggressive negotiator persona. "You must be the Hollywood money," Richard said, extending a hand that Julian cautiously shook. "Richard Sterling, I'm Iris's business advisor, and I'm here to tell you that this whole community fund nonsense is off the table. We're ready to talk real numbers." My moment had arrived. I felt a profound calm settle over me. I looked at Richard, at his expensive suit and his desperate need to control the narrative, and I felt nothing but a distant pity. I turned to Julian, ignoring my ex-husband completely. "Julian, thank you for coming. What did your team say?" Julian, looking from me to Richard, seemed to make a decision. He chose to align with me. They were impressed, Iris, unconventional, as I said, but they see the value in a genuine partnership. They've agreed to your terms, all of them. The fund, the local hiring, the internships. They want to be good neighbors, not invaders. A slow smile spread across my face. It was a victory for Havenwood, for all of us. Richard was speechless for a second, his face a mask of disbelief. "You went behind my back," he hissed at me. "You accepted that pittance of a deal." "It was never your deal, Richard," I said, my voice ringing with clarity in the quiet store. "And it's not a pittance. It's an investment in a future. Something you know nothing about. You see a building, I see a home. You see a line item, I see a community. You see a weak, sentimental woman you can bully, but you're wrong." I took a step closer to him, my gaze unwavering. "You laughed at me. You told me I was throwing my life away on a romantic fantasy. But look around. This fantasy just secured the future of an entire town. This pile of rotting timber has more integrity than you have in your entire portfolio. The money you think I wasted has generated a value you can't measure because it's a value of the heart. It's about self-respect and building something that matters. You lost the ability to understand that a long, long time ago." He stood there, his mouth slightly agape. For the first time, there was no witty retort, no condescending sigh. He was utterly defeated, exposed as a man whose only metric for worth had been rendered meaningless. The parents who had been pretending to browse were now watching openly. Martha had a proud, fierce smile on her face. Even the children were peeking out from the reading nook, sensing a shift in the adult world. He looked at me, then at Julian, then around the bookstore that he had so thoroughly misjudged. He saw not a single ally, not a single person who saw the world his way. Humiliation washed over his features, a dull red creeping up his neck. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store. The bell chimed his final exit from my life. We all watched as he got into his ridiculous silver car, revved the engine with a furious, impotent roar, and sped away, leaving Havenwood behind for good. The quiet that followed wasn't tense or awkward. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a story finding its perfect ending. In the aftermath of Richard's departure, the air in the gilded page seemed lighter. Julian Croft shook my head, a look of genuine admiration in his eyes. "Your ex-husband?" he asked gently. I simply nodded. "Well," he said with a small smile, "this town is lucky to have you, Iris Thorne." The deal we signed was everything I had hoped for and more. It became a new model for location filming, one that emphasized partnership over exploitation. The lawyers from the studio, accustomed to bare-knuckle tactics, were initially bewildered by my insistence on clauses protecting local businesses, but with Julian championing the cause, the contract was solidified. Havenwood was going to be the home of Ethilgard's legacy, but it was going to do so on its own terms. The transformation of Main Street was magical. Talented artisans and craftspeople, many of them hired from the surrounding county as per our agreement, turned the familiar storefronts into a breathtaking fantasy village. The gilded page became the scribe's lantern, its exterior adorned with wrought iron filigree and glowing, mystical-looking lamps. But inside, it remained my sanctuary. The cast and crew were incredibly respectful. They'd wander in on their breaks, buying books, sipping coffee, and treating the space with a reverence that warmed my heart. The lead actor, a famous British thespian, even agreed to do a special dramatic reading for my Saturday Story Hour, an event that drew families from 3 counties over. My bookstore flourished. It became famous, not just as a film set, but as the little shop that stood its ground. Tourists and fans of the show began making pilgrimages to Havenwood, and they always stopped at the gilded page. They'd buy a book, take a picture, and ask me to tell them the story, the real one. The Community Preservation Fund, administered by a board that included me, Martha, and Mayor Thompson, began its work. We approved a grant to help the Gables restore the bakery's 100-year-old brick oven. We funded the replacement of the town hall's leaky roof. The internship program was a resounding success, with several local teenagers discovering passions that would lead to future careers. I saw the results of my stand every single day, in the revitalized spirit of the town I now called home. I never heard from Richard again. I read once, in a small notice in a business journal, that his company had suffered a major loss on a high-risk development in Dubai. It mentioned his reputation had been damaged due to aggressive and ultimately alienating tactics. I felt no surge of triumph, no vindictive pleasure. I just felt a quiet sense of finality. His world of high-stakes gambling and empty victories was so far removed from mine now that it felt like reading about a foreign country. His downfall wasn't my victory. My victory was the life I had built, entirely separate from him. One evening, months later, I was locking up the store. The film crew had packed up for the day, and a gentle snow was beginning to fall, dusting Main Street in a layer of pristine white. The scribe's lantern sign glowed softly, casting a warm light onto the falling flakes. Martha came out of her shop, wrapping a scarf around her neck. "Looks like a postcard, doesn't it?" she said, smiling at me. "It really does," I agreed, my heart full. "You did good, Iris," she said, her voice soft. "You reminded us all what this place was really worth." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, two friends watching the snow fall on our town. The ghost of Richard's laughter was long gone, replaced by the gentle hum of a community at peace. I had come to Havenwood seeking refuge, a place to heal. I had used my settlement to buy a bookstore, a decision born of quiet desperation. But in the end, it wasn't an expense. It was the soundest investment I had ever made. I hadn't just bought a building, I had bought back my life. And its value was, and always would be, priceless.